Welcome to the story of a man who became known as the Black Prince of Scunthorpe. Born an African prince, captured and enslaved by Arab slave traders, he was brought to Britain by missionaries and became a missionary himself. He ended his days as something of a celebrity in Scunthorpe, the first black man in the town. My name is Adrian Gray, and I'm Historical Advisor with Pilgrims and Prophets Christian Heritage Tours in Nottinghamshire and Lincolnshire. We love to celebrate the lives of some of the remarkable people connected with our part of England, and this is one of the most remarkable of all. Salim Wilson was actually named Hatashil Khatish when he was born in what is now South Sudan in about 1859. He was a member of the Dinka tribe. According to his own account, his father had the status of a prince or priest, but this did not mean life was easy. One odd thing that he remembers is that one of his aunts kept snakes, which she trained to guard her. Unfortunately, that area of Africa was plagued by slavery. Britain had banned the slave trade in 1807, and in 1833 it banned slavery from anywhere in the British Empire. But the slave trade was still thriving along the east coast of Africa with Zanzibar. In 1876, Hatashil's village was attacked by Arab slave traders, and all the huts were set on fire. Hatashil's father tried to fight the slavers off, but he only had a spear and they had guns. So they killed his father and took the boy off to be a slave. Most of the East African slave trade was managed through the island of Zanzibar, where Arab Muslims controlled the work under the Sultan of Zanzibar. Sometimes rival African tribes would provide their captives to the slavers. Hatashil recalled that Africans were despised and treated badly. He was sold to a new owner who forced him to become a Muslim and gave him an Arab name, Salim. Salim became a piece of property and was sold to other owners. Once he was swapped for 6 yards of cloth. To make sure they could not run away, the slaves were branded on the cheek with a hot iron. One of Hatashil's masters cut his cheek 3 times, then salt and gunpowder were rubbed into the wound. Eventually, he became the personal slave of an Arab merchant. Although Hatashil may have felt hopeless, help was actually at hand. Since David Livingstone in the 1850s, British missionaries had been demanding that their government act to stop slave trading by Arabs and also by the Portuguese. The very year that Hatashil was captured, the British had forced the Sultan to stop the slave trade, although owning slaves was still legal in Zanzibar. So the famous Scottish missionary David Livingstone had begun a campaign to have slavery stopped in the 1850s, and it had become part of British foreign policy. In 1879, aged about 20, Hatashil was rescued from slavery. He was saved because his owner chose to side with Romolo Gesai, an Italian soldier and explorer working for the famous British general Charles Gordon. Gordon was a complex man with a deep evangelical Christian faith, and he also promoted the view that what is now known as the Garden Tomb was where Jesus was buried at Golgotha in Jerusalem. Since the mid-1870s, he had been working to stop slavery in Sudan and East Africa. General Gordon is sometimes credited with having discovered the site of the Garden Tomb at Golgotha in Jerusalem, the famous skull-shaped rock. In fact, the location of Golgotha was first proposed by a German in 1842, and the tomb itself was first uncovered in 1867. But it was Gordon's arrival in 1883 that led to the idea of it being Christ's tomb becoming better known. Now it is a significant pilgrimage site, though the shape of Golgotha has been altered by earthquakes. Gordon's campaigns in Africa eventually ran into serious problems, and he was killed in a revolt at Khartoum in 1885. Salim, as he was now known, was looked after by two British missionaries, Charles Wilson and Dr. Robert Felkin. Felkin and Wilson wrote a famous book about their travels, which illustrated what they had seen. It was also translated successfully into German. Charles Wilson was actually born in Adelaide, Australia. Given that it was impossible for him to get back to his home, Wilson decided to take the young man back to Britain with him and to teach him the gospel. Felkin and Wilson, with Hatashil, set off overland to reach the River Nile and Egypt in June 1879. It took them 10 months to reach Britain, but they used the journey to gather information and draw pictures of the sights that they saw on the way. Robert Felkin's main interests were in medicine, and he became something of an expert on tropical diseases. He also recorded how he had seen advanced childbirth techniques, such as caesarean sections, being performed in Ugandan villages. However, later in life, he turned his back on Christianity and became obsessed with occult religion. In contrast, Wilson later returned to missionary work in Palestine. Missionaries like Wilson were pioneers for their faith, and a high proportion of the earliest missionaries died. Their earliest mission stations were very simple, like this one. In 1877, Wilson had been in the first party of Europeans to cross what became known as Lake Victoria in a boat, and whilst there he was wounded by a poisoned arrow. In fact, he was saved by a companion who sucked the poison out of his wound. By 1879, he was one of the only ones of that party still alive. This print gives an idea of the more developed mission camps that were gradually established, but although the scene may look idyllic, there was a constant problem with disease. Wilson himself had been ill and needed to get back to Britain to recover. This is the grave of Dr. John Smith, a medical man who came with Wilson on the 1877 expedition. The chances of survival were very, very low. Salim, as he was still known, went with Charles Wilson and some others back to England. It was a huge journey for him, travelling to a country of which he knew very little at a time when it was the centre of a vast empire that spanned the globe. One of the purposes of Wilson's journey was to take some African rulers from what is now Uganda to meet Queen Victoria, and Hatashil or Salim came along with them on the way to Britain. In the end, they all stayed with Wilson's father, who was a vicar in the Bedfordshire village of Pavenham. Hatashil or Salim was clever enough to be aware of his surroundings and also of how people would perceive him. He was quite prepared in later life to play up to stories of ignorant little Africans if it won him some attention. This is how he described first arriving in London and seeing a mirror, if you believe him. As he wrote, "You have no doubt been told by travellers that few things please a black man more than a mirror. But I cannot say I was very pleased when I faced one for the first time in my life in the London hotel. 'Ah,' said I, as I caught sight of a black boy, 'where do you come from?' As he did not deign to make a reply, I went a little nearer to him. But whatever I did, he did too, and yet he would not speak. The glass stood by a chest of drawers, which I moved that I might discover his whereabouts. Of course, I did not find him. The whole thing was a mystery too overpowering for my brain. I examined the back of the mirror, and when I found it was all wood, I grew so angry at having been, as I thought, befooled, that I believe if I had not heard footsteps near, I should have smashed the mirror into atoms.' Well, I'll leave you to decide if it was really quite like the way he described it. Wilson took him to Pavenham in Bedfordshire, where Wilson's father was the vicar. Hatashil seems to have found learning at the village school a struggle, although he was sent to school with children who were 10 years or more younger than he was. Everybody in the village was kind to me, he later wrote, and many of the good people gave me money. Generally speaking, the lads of Pavenham were kind to me, but of course they could not resist having their bit of fun out of me, most of which was comparatively harmless. Sometimes, however, it was not so innocent. They would try to get rough with me, but when it came to that, I was more than a match for them. He was also not really a Christian at this point, having only vague ideas about what he had heard. What I read in the Bible I did not understand, he said. Like my countrymen mentioned in the Acts, I needed the teaching of God's Holy Spirit. He illustrated his lack of understanding with a little story about himself. I was some time before I could get rid of the fear that Mr. Wilson might go to heaven and leave me. I always felt safest when he was in sight. When I was able to make myself understood and communicated my feelings and fears to one of his younger brothers, this gentleman kindly enlightened me on the subject. He talked about heaven and made the word of God clear to my understanding. He showed me that it was possible for me to reach heaven myself, and I began to see matters more clearly. As he learnt to read and write at school, Hatashil also became clearer about what the Bible had to say about Jesus. This reminded him about how his own father had died in an attempt to save him from the slave traders. He described this in his autobiography. My father had died for me. He might have escaped if it had not been for me. To deliver me from slavery, he braved a cruel death and perished before my eyes. Thus I saw that Christ had died for me to deliver me from eternal death and to rescue me from the bondage of sin. The Wilsons moved to Nottingham for a while and took Salim along with the family. By this stage his education had progressed a great deal. He could read and he had a growing understanding of the Bible. He turned his back on the Muslim faith that had been forced on him and became a Christian. In 1882 he was baptised at Nottingham's Holy Trinity Church and took the name Salim Wilson, though he later went back to using his birth name Hatashil Khatish. Meanwhile, Wilson himself spent some time as a country curate in 1881-3, but soon decided to volunteer for missionary service again. Next, he chose to go to Cliff College, a Methodist training college near Sheffield. Here he met two other Africans, the first he had seen in England. They began to discuss how to get back to Africa to be missionaries there. But first, Hatashil travelled with Wilson to Palestine in 1883 and met his hero, General Gordon, at Jaffa. However, some issues developed and Hatashil went home early. One historian suggested the problem was that Hatashil went as Wilson's servant because he could also speak Arabic and found himself treated very much as a servant in Jaffa. In 1884-5, during a period of trouble in Sudan, he toured the north of England with Cliff College's superintendent while dressed in a leopard skin and turban, portraying a Sudanese redeemed by Christ. Then in 1886, he went to London to work for the YMCA and, improbably, the Women's Temperance Journal. But in his heart, he wanted to get back to Africa and to take the gospel to his own people, the Dinka. Hatashil decided that his best chance of reaching his own people was to join a mission, and he agreed to travel with Graham Wilmot Brooke up the Congo River in 1887. He expected to be able to enter Sudan from the headwaters of the Congo. Brooke has been described as having an intense and intolerant spiritual enthusiasm, which led him to clash with many other church leaders and missionaries. Hatashil's own account said that Brooke began to develop some theological views that he could not agree with. Brooke had led a group to Niger, which had clashed with the first African bishop there, Samuel Crover, and this time his plan was rather too ambitious. Hatashil became disillusioned when he realised that the mission was not going to get anywhere near his homeland or the Dinka people, and relations with Brooke soured. He clashed with Brooke, and Brooke effectively sacked him from the mission in 1888. Brooke himself returned to England in 1889. Hatashil went to work on mission in a different territory, the Forestry of Dean, on the border between England and Wales. In 1893, he joined up with two evangelists from Bolton to go on an independent mission to Tripoli. Much to his surprise, he found a small group of Dinka exiles living there and was able to speak to them in his own language, words which he had not used for many years. For a decade, he travelled the country, mainly from a base near Wakefield, lecturing, preaching, singing, and telling his life story, always with a Christian message. Often he wore his traditional clothes, although he was once mistaken for wearing Arab dress. He appeared everywhere, from Cromer to Aberdeen. Hatashil seems to have been an intelligent and independent man who did not fit into prejudiced concepts at the time that Africans should be quiet and subservient. In 1905, one missionary wrote that, "I believed him to be a Christian man, but he was so very full of life and so excitable that he was not the quiet, sober-minded man I had met with in other Africans. He is a clever man, no doubt." Historian Douglas Johnson concluded that he lacked the deference which was expected in an African subordinate in an English mission at the time. Therefore, he seems to have been at his best when travelling the country using his unusual story to attract interest in the gospel. We can track his movements, and no doubt he carried his African costume with him on the train as he went. However, he was never able to get back to speak to his Dinka tribe again. Instead, he was asked by the British and Foreign Bible Society to help with a revised translation of the Gospel of Luke. This was itself based on earlier work by a German missionary and also by the very early Catholic priests who had reached his tribe before he was born. It served as a foundation for the whole Bible being available for the Dinka today. Hatashil found going on mission frustrating. He could not reach his own people, and the British missionaries underestimated his abilities. He decided to work independently, but he could only afford to do this in Britain. In 1902, he turned up in the Lincolnshire village of Heckington, preaching at a Wesleyan temperance society. In 1905, he chose to live in Heckington, but he also spent periods with mission churches in Wakefield and Barnsley. He soon realised that to get attention, missionaries and evangelists needed an angle, and of course he had used tribal costume in his days with Cliff College. So he played upon the idea of an African prince and happily wore a leopard costume. However, he taught that people should trust Jesus, not alcohol, and denounced the British trade in rum to Africa. He also taught that slavery was still going on in Africa. The work as a travelling preacher gradually wore him down. He needed a more settled life. So in 1911, he chose to work with Bethel 3 Mission, run by Miss Gutcher in Gilead Street, Scunthorpe, where he was second in charge. As the only black man in town, he found that children were scared of him. He was not always a great success as a preacher either. One who heard him said, "He spoke very slowly and at too great length for some of his younger listeners." Nonetheless, he made a big impression in the town, and I've spoken to people who, as children, can remember seeing him around, found him frightening at first, but lovely once you got to know him. Hatashil spent the rest of his life in Scunthorpe, where it would be very easy to follow a heritage trail from where he first lived to where he got married and then where he built some houses. Here we can see Gilead Street, where the Bethel Mission stood, and just around the corner is 45 Burke Street, where he lodged with a widowed member of the church, Eliza Holden. Clearly, Hatashil and his landlady Eliza fell in love, and they got married at Scunthorpe's Primitive Methodist Church in 1913. The wedding attracted great interest because of his background. But a lot of the press coverage we would feel a little uncomfortable about today, although there was little that was overtly negative. The camera crew even came to film the wedding for newsreels. There was much comment about his background as a prince, but most coverage used the name Salim rather than his true name Hatashil. Press provided some delightful coverage of the wedding. Here's a couple of examples. Police mingled with the crowd, obviously expecting trouble, but there was none. The bride and groom arrived in a taxi, the bride dressed in Quaker grey, trimmed with cream lace with matching hat. Her bridesmaids were Miss Florrie Holden, her daughter, and Miss Polly Heald. They wore champagne-coloured dresses and hats trimmed in pale blue. The best man was William Challenger, a missioner from the United Methodist Church at Hoyland near Barnsley. Another account wrote, "The tremendous interest aroused by this wedding was partly the result of the obvious disparities in the match. Mr. Wilson was African, tall, and very black. Mrs. Holden was English, white, and dainty. Even in her extravagant wedding hat, she barely reached his shoulders." Of course, a lot of the interest was sparked by the racial element of the marriage, plus the fact that Hatashil was known throughout the area as the Black Prince, which added a touch of royal glamour to life in Scunthorpe. We would certainly be uncomfortable about some of the press coverage today, including some of the vocabulary in this example, but I've not seen any coverage that could be described as hostile to the wedding. That said, attitudes have progressed, and the sort of coverage here would not be acceptable anymore. The Bethel mission had financial problems, but with his wife not well, he needed to build a more settled life. So he built some houses in Frodingham Road, Scunthorpe, which he named Khatish Villas and Gordon Villas after his hero. One of these became the shop that was his main source of income. Here you can see Mrs. Wilson with a nephew outside the shop, and you can also see the house next to it, his name Khatish Villa, his family name. All the buildings are still there today, though the scene has changed quite a lot and you cannot see the house name anymore. Hatashil rented out some of his houses. He also kept pigs on his Normanby Road allotment, which helped to supply a meat stall that he ran at Scunthorpe Market and also his shop. During this period, he seems to have led a quieter life, but he did get into the newspapers after he was accused of trespass and false imprisonment in June 1913. This was all over a row with the tenant of one of his houses. The Lincolnshire Chronicle referred to him as the Prince throughout its coverage of the story. Hatashil did become something of a celebrity in Scunthorpe, but also on his travels. His first autobiography was published in 1901, and he revised it and extended it through several new editions. However, he did hit a financial problem. He applied for the old age pension, but it turned out he had never completed any naturalisation papers and so was not a British citizen and thus did not qualify for a pension. So he had to keep the shop going and earn something as well from book royalties. On top of this, he still did an occasional bit of preaching well into the 1920s. Here is one example, and you will notice he has started to use his full birth name. He preached several times in Hull in 1928 to 1931, raising awareness of the problem that many people in Africa were still held in slavery. In the 1920s and 1930s, Lady Simon led a vigorous anti-slavery movement and came to speak in Hull in 1933. That year, Hatashil had a starring role at the centenary celebration in Hull commemorating 100 years since the death of William Wilberforce, the MP for the town. He posed with an image of Wilberforce, by which time he comes across the proper old gentleman. Later in his life, he continued to write about his experiences. In these, he reflected on his Dinka origins and especially the religion that he'd been born into. He denied that the Dinka had been idol-worshipping heathens and argued that their beliefs included the Creator God, the Holy Spirit, and an afterlife. He published a new book, I Was a Slave, in 1933. In fact, he also came to believe that there were ancient connections between the Dinka people and Israel, and that he had been born into a priestly clan on Israelite lines, by which right he could be regarded as a priest even in England. Interestingly, ideas about African Israelites had begun to circulate in the 1880s, but were most famously recognized in Ethiopia. In 1939, he had his 80th birthday and was celebrated as the last man alive in Britain, at least, who had been freed from slavery. He would have told you that he'd been freed from slavery twice, once by General Gordon and once by Jesus Christ. He died 5 years after his wife and is buried in Scunthorpe, where you can still see his grave today. It has even had some visits from Dinka people, so he has reached them in death, if not in life. If you enjoyed this story, you can find out many more in my various books, which are about aspects of Lincolnshire history, but also about faith history. Restless Souls Pilgrim Routes covers the story of the Christian faith in the area up to 1660, and the later period will be covered in another volume out soon. We have also produced various guides to the area, all available from Bookworm Retford or your local bookshop.